So Tamila Lenkina is a professor in the Department of International Relations, and she'll be giving us a sneak preview of her new book, which is to be published at the end of the year. And after her talk, we will have time for questions. So have a think about those and write any that you have in the chat at the end. And we'll come to those at the end of the session. So I will hand over to Tamila now. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you very much for organizing this event. And I feel very privileged to be kind of part of the inaugural talk. And it's very nice to see some familiar names and faces also in the audience. So without much ado, let me begin with this image. This is an image of that you see very much in the shadows, and it's kind of deliberately sought to convey this notion of the destruction of the Russian bourgeoisie after the revolution. This is an image of a widow of a large merchant clan with her 7 children. This is just one branch of a very, very large family, and a large part of that family stayed in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution. When we think about images like this, what they conjure is destruction, decimation, obliteration. These are all the kind of narratives that we are familiar with, those of us who know about the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia of 1917. My book, however, is all about continuities, survival, resilience of the bourgeoisie and social structure, and its reproduction from Tsarist times through communism and to the present. Now, let me just flip to the next slide, if I can. I'm pressing down and it's not moving. Louise, do you, can you flip it down?
I'll do it for you, yeah, hang on.
Thank you. So there's no way I can do justice to the book and also I'm sure to your questions that might be popping up in just about 25 minutes. So before I start, I wanted to give you some indication of where you can get more information in sort of quick summaries. One is a paper that just came out with American Political Science Review, co-authored with Alexander Liebman, which gives you a sense of the kind of rich data that we worked with and I worked with in my book to show these continuities. There's a very short blog on a historical political economy site called Broad Street that kind of encapsulates the main findings. And of course, there's my website where you can check out more about information about the research and the book. Next slide, please. So how did we get it all so wrong? When I talk about continuities, whereas we've come to think about the Bolshevik Revolution as a rupture, well, I discuss these misconceptions in terms of various clouding narratives, and I summarized some of those for you. One is, of course, the propaganda machine of the new Bolshevik state itself, and that's where the origin of these myths about clean slate, complete rupture, building a new society on the ashes of the old, obliteration of the old bourgeoisie. This all comes from the kind of the imagery and the propaganda machinery of the new nascent Bolshevik state. Then we also get the narratives of Western intellectuals, many of whom rushed to kind of celebrate this new socialist state, not least the co-founders of this august institution, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who paid a visit to Stalinist Russia in the early 1930s and published a book which became quite notorious. First, it came out with a question mark: is Soviet communism a new civilization, or Soviet communism a new civilization? Question mark. subsequent editions came up without the question mark. And this book kind of very much peddled the narratives of the Bolsheviks building a new society and the kind of tremendous achievements, not least with regards to human capital and elimination of socioeconomic inequalities. And most recently, we have narratives that are couched mostly in economic terms. And of course, we all know the famous book by Thomas Piketty, which kind of cast inequalities largely in material and materialist terms, and in which the revolutions of the 20th century, communist regimes and revolutions, as indeed wars, are portrayed or couched in the language of the great leveler. So we have these great leveler narratives which look at material aspects of inequality rather than examining the nitty-gritty of kind of other types of capital, like human capital, social capital, cultural capital, that I look for in my book. And there are reasons for that, because economic dimensions of inequality are more easily measurable, the data are more easily available, and the data are far harder to come by for contexts of the kind that I am researching, which is Soviet Russia, where old records were destroyed and statistics were fudged. So this is a big challenge, but you get a sense of where we got some of the things wrong. Louise, next slide, please. So if we're talking about continuities between the imperial Tsarist Russian society, the Soviet period, and the present, we need to understand the nature of the society or social structure or social pyramid before the revolution. And I draw attention in my book on the largely neglected, even by historians, institution of estate. When I say institution, it was an institution. It regimented everything from how many taxes you paid to whether you were free, citizen or subject, to whether you were free to move and what kind of educational institutions you attended, what kind of professions you went into. So the state structure in Russia divided society into peasants at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, and the vast majority of citizens were Russian imperial citizenry were peasants. Then there was the category of urban groups called mishani, something like a petty bourgeoisie, merchants, clergy, and of course at the very apex, the aristocracy. And aristocracy and clergy and merchants, they formed tiny percentages of the population. But as I discuss in my book, they colonized as well as merchants and mishani, educational institutions and the professions on the eve of the revolution. Now it should be said that estate structure and as an institution, it survived until 1917. The Bolsheviks abolished it with one of their first decrees. But it's very important for understanding the genesis and the emergence of the bourgeoisie and the middle class in the modern sense of the term, because the peasants remained overwhelmingly illiterate and outside of the modern professions. The three major other estates were actually colonizing the modern professions. I'll come back to that. Next slide, please. So aside from the human capital dimensions of estate, I also look at the public sphere and the extent to which they colonized it. So let me draw your attention to first the image on the left of the triangle. And if you look at the very bottom part of the triangle, you see the social ladder I kind of constructed in a stylized way. You could, if you were a peasant, ascend into the Mishani estate with quite a lot of effort. You had to own urban property, etc. You can also, if you're a Mishanin, enter the category of merchants or personal nobles, and personal, eventually, nobility as well. And there were, of course, hereditary aristocrats as well in the kind of social hierarchy. The clergy were somewhat outside of this kind of ladder-like system, but they were privileged in the sense that they were some of the most educated groups in Russian society, albeit not very wealthy. If you look at the middle part of the triangle, this is what I construct as the public sphere, which was overwhelmingly colonized by the aristocrats and merchants, with some mishani and clergy, of course, because they were educated. And on the eve of the revolution, towards the end of the early 20th century, this proto-middle class was very well networked. Again, this is a narrative that, one narrative I'm trying to challenge in my book is the atomized nature of Russian imperial society, the weak public sphere, weak civil society, etc. How do we challenge it? And so one way of doing it is to construct a data set and perform social network analysis. And I draw your attention to the image on the right, which is what my very clever PhD students did. And and I trust them. They assured me that their formal social network analysis shows that the networks were very tight and very robust. It was a highly networked society. This is an example of one city of over 2,000 entries. And you see the large sort of dots, for instance, the blue and the green one, they represent the kind of clusters of networks. And these united, for instance, pedagogues in gymnasia or schools, and enlightenment groups, welfare bodies, charities, and professional associations. So why are networks important if we talk about the revolution? Well, if people are connected, and if they have friends and contacts that they could trust, who belong to the same estate as you are, aristocrats or merchants or clergymen, that means they're more likely to survive. We know that from social network analyses in modern settings. You know, you need social networks to get on, to other people to help you, etc., whether professionally or in other sense. So if you look at the very top of the triangle, you see the very top state layer. These were the police, the courts, etc., the governor bodies. And when historians even analyzed the Russian Revolution, they usually look at this very, very top layer that was indeed decimated. They don't look at this middle layer of the vastly networked and enormous public sphere and very well connected. And that's what I kind of examine and focus on in my book. If you could go to the next slide, please. So this is another way of capturing social networks in Imperial Russia. If you look at for instance, this dark on the left clump, it shows that individuals who worked in this organization were very, very weakly connected to just about any other sort of organization or society. Whereas you have, for instance, the pink gymnasium at the top, and it's very wishy-washy. The wishy-washiness means that it's really plugged into a lot of different initiatives and life. And in that city, and people were extremely well connected. And these are the organizations like schools, professional associations that were, or museums and museum societies. The Bolsheviks didn't destroy them right away. They survived and people continued to be networked. And this is, by the way, from a kind of like a directory, like the yellow pages of Imperial Russia for 1916. That is just 1 year before the revolution. So it's a good window into what society was like. And actually I could trace the names of people, what happened to them after the revolution. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So another way of tracing these continuities is to dig into archives. Now, I was extremely fortunate to find what is, even for historians, a very rare repository of merchant documents and window into merchant life in Imperial Russia. When I say it's rare and a very precious resource, it's because people in Russia were destroying these. You could be shot if the Bolsheviks found out that you were a prominent merchant. People would hide their origins. Why these records survived is because one part of the family emigrated to America. You see them on the left, Konstantin Klutin and his wife Polya. These are from their American visa stamps in the city of Harbin in China, where they first decamped. So they moved to America, but they have over 30 different close relatives. And those relatives write to them letters and they ask them to send money. And so we have records of remittances letters, and a great window into how people were living through the Great Famine in the 1920s in the Volga region, how they engaged in the shadow economy of entrepreneurship. And if you look on the image on the right, you will see that, and we have records of what happened to each and every person on that image of that family. In the middle, for instance, is the matriarch, Anastasia, who is Constantine's mother. She lived on until the 1930 or so in Soviet Russia. Some of the, especially male relatives, they perished in the Civil War, but by looking, we have this kind of a bad news bias. We tend to focus on the deaths and the gulags and those who perished and were incarcerated. As human beings, we are naturally attracted to these kind of catastrophism stories. We don't think about those who survived, and that's the part of the story I'm looking at. If we go to the next slide, please. So we also have increasingly people like myself and others in Russia digging into their ancestries. They're opening closets that they had to keep closed through the communist period because they were simply afraid to talk about their merchant or clergyman ancestry. And so as I put it on this slide, is we all know what happened to Nicholas and Alexandra, the Tsar and his wife, but we don't know what happened to the provincial veterinarian or the provincial proprietor of a hair salon. But now we know, thanks to these ancestral kind of genealogies that individual families are gathering, and thanks to my book. So on these two images on the left, we see a family of a clergyman. I think he was a clergyman because he went to a seminary, which was typical for the clergy as an estate. And he was veterinarian before the revolution and continued in the Soviet period. If you look at his CV, he did exactly what he was doing after the revolution. And on the right, this is the proprietor of a hair salon, and he's an ancestor of one of the living descendants in that same city. And I can tell you that their descendants have done extremely well for themselves. They're the descendants of the quintessential bourgeoisie, and they're now professoriate. The young man who supplied this picture on the left is pursuing PhD in aerocosmic, whatever science or engineering. So I don't have any doubts that he will do extremely well for themselves. And this contrasts, as I show with data, with what happened to the peasantry in terms of their human capital and position in the social structure of Soviet Russia. Next slide, please. So why should we care about estates, the proto-bourgeoisie and its reproduction? Well, from a lot of the theorizing in historical political economy, economics, political science, sociology, we know that the bourgeoisie is kind of a force for either development or democracy, albeit in these classic discussions like from Barrington Moore, for instance, they're usually about coalitional dynamics, the origins of particular regimes and orders in a historical sense. Whereas I look at the bourgeoisie as a kind of self-reproducing intergenerational category. I kind of challenge this assumption that well, we can talk about the bourgeoisie as an important force for whatever democracy or development in Western settings, but in places like China or Russia, we don't really talk about the bourgeoisie because the assumption is that it's been destroyed. And there are some recent studies of even China, for instance, the work by Gregory Clark that shows that actually in China, the social structure from before the revolution managed to somehow survive through the dark years, even of the Cultural Revolution and into the present. So the residues of the past imperial Chinese social structure also survives. But these studies tend to be, because of paucity of data, kind of weak on context. We don't really understand the causal mechanisms, how this reproduction happens. And one of the challenges, especially in communist states, is how do we disentangle the old from the new middle class? After all, nobody is denying, and I'm the last person to do so as well, that communist countries did promote social mobility. They did raise and elevate a lot of people from poverty and educated a lot of people. But there's this other side of the story of the parallel reproduction of the old bourgeoisie. How do we disentangle those two? So we can do that by gathering very systematic and fine-grained macro and sort of micro survey data, which is what I did. Next slide, please. So for instance, these maps illustrate the distribution of estates in Imperial Russia, mapping on present day Russian boundaries. And I will illustrate just for two estates, Nobility and Mishani. We can see that they are heterogeneously distributed across Russia's, or they were rather, across Russia's districts and provinces. And for instance, for Nobility, we see that they're not just clustered in that northwest bit, which is the deep red, and that corresponds to St. Petersburg, but also in some Far Eastern and Siberian regions. Why? Because historically they were often exiled, because they were freedom loving. They were educated people who wanted enlightenment in a Tsarist society. And for Mishani, if you look at the map on the right, these urban trading groups, they were present in a lot of kind of frontier regions and in kind of old historical towns, including, by the way, in Siberia. But you can see that the distribution is very heterogeneous. Next slide, please. And from this image, we can illustrate the causal structure of the argument I make in my book, but this is from the paper I published with Alexander Liebman in APSR this year. And it's just focusing on Mishani, on the urban bourgeoisie. And the bottom line is we look at two things, human capital and entrepreneurial values. With human capital, there is a big muddle, because one could say that isn't human capital a product of Bolshevik Soviet policies? You can't say that for entrepreneurial values, right? Because they didn't promote entrepreneurship. They were kind of making it a felony to trade and you know, do market activities. But we can trace those survival of those values. And we also show that to a certain extent, there was a convergence between Soviet policy, which leveraged the old experts, and the kind of bottom-up impulse for the social group, the privileged groups to survive. And the political outcomes, we have variations in contemporary rather outcomes. We have variations in the Russian regions in both democratic freedoms, but also in development, if we trace connections to the old bourgeoisie. Next slide, please. And this is, I don't have time, I don't think, to go into any of this, but this is an illustration of statistical correlations between what I call the educated estates, that's the non-peasants, and university education in the 2000s, and also political freedoms, if we use the regional measure of media freedom or press freedom that we can work with. We show that regions that had large chunks of that imperial proto-bourgeoisie, the educated estates, they're more free, more open, but they also have a more developed human capital. Next slide, please. So what are the contributions of this book beyond the kind of intrinsic historical interest? So first of all, it's part of this big and exciting new turn in a kind of historical turn in the social sciences, where scholars are working to combine rigorous data with historical sources. So there is a big dialogue with historians. I extended also into sociology, and I comb through history as well and engage with historiography and actually critique historians of Soviet Union and Russia for getting things quite badly wrong. And in my book, I explain why there's been such neglect of these continuities. And also my book urges us, when we talk about inequalities, to go beyond these narratives. And I know Thomas Piketty has done us a great service for bringing attention to these glaring inequalities, but in a way, it's also, there's a kind of issue there, because the focus is almost exclusively on the material dimension of inequalities. My book shows that you can level out as much as you want, you can expropriate, you can even try to physically exterminate entire groups, which is what they did in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s. But you cannot destroy human capital and other sorts of capitals that are intangible and that will survive, no matter how much you try to redistribute in a material sense. And that, of course, has tremendous implications for understanding inequalities in Russia now, because the bourgeoisie of the imperial era has done extremely well, or quite well, in the Soviet period, and continues to be the elite, or even the new aristocracy, whether we look at the arts, the professoriate, the academia, or the entrepreneurial society. And these are the autonomous groups that can escape political pressures in an increasingly consolidating Russian autocracy.